לי ביצורו ויוקי לי וחי גויה לי וצורכם לי ביצורו ויוקי לי וחי גויה לי וצורכם לי ביצורו
חי גויאלי וצור חבלי ביסורו ויוקלי וחי גויאלי וצור חבלי ביסורו ויוקלי וחי גויאלי וצור חבלי ביסורו
חי גויה לי צוכב לי ביצורו ויוקי לי וחי גויה לי וצוכב לי ביצורו ויוקי לי וחי גויה לי וצוכב לי ביצורו חי גויה לי וצוכב לי ביסורו ויוקי לי וחי גויה לי וצוכב לי ביסורו
Good evening, everyone. There is a very interesting Tiferet Yisrael in Mishnayos, which might be a surprise. And he speaks about who are considered to be Chasidei Umais Ha'olam. There is a concept of Chasidei Umas Ha'olam, certain members of the Gentile world who are considered to be extremely pious. And if I remember correctly, I didn't see it right now, the Tiferet Yisrael in Mishnayos says, he mentions a number of special people who contributed greatly to civilization. And he mentions amongst them the inventor of the printing press, Johann Gutenberg, who I'm sure we'll hear more about soon. That he is considered to be one of the Chasidei Umas Ha'olam because it's through the printing press that there's so much Torah that was able to be disseminated and to be spread, and so much Torah was learned in his merit. Rabbi Aronson tonight is going to give a presentation on the development of this printing press and how it was used through the great printers and Jewish printers in disseminating Torah. And the book that he has written, which I've gone through, is the word I could only use, it's an exquisite work. One sees how much effort and concentration and detail and love that was put into it. And we want to thank him very, very much for the presentation that he's going to make right now. And I hope that everybody is going to support the wonderful work that Rabbi Emerson is doing.
Thank you, Rabbi Arbach. The invention of printing is attributed to Johann Gutenberg of Mainz, Germany. Gutenberg was born around the year 1400, the son of the master of the mint, the place where they made the coins of the realm. Mainz in Germany at the time being a center of metalwork. Gutenberg himself was trained as a silversmith or a goldsmith, which gave him the skill of working with metals. This would provide him with the basis of his later invention. Gutenberg's invention was letters of metal type. He cut the form of each letter out of hard metal, pressed it into soft metal to make a mold. Into the mold he poured molten metal, which upon hardening left him with individual letters of metal type for each letter of the alphabet. These could then be aligned together to make up words, sentences, and whole pages, ready for printing, and afterwards taken apart for further text. Gutenberg also played a part in the development of a new type of ink. Previously, ink was water-based, made by mixing soot with water. However, that type of ink would simply run off metal letters, and Gutenberg needed to make a new type of ink which would work with his letters. He heated vegetable oil to a high temperature, mixed that with soot, and in that way produced a new form of ink which would indeed stick to metal letters. In addition, Gutenberg adapted the wine press to printing. The press would come down and press paper onto inked typeface below it, one sheet at a time. Although these two types of press worked according to the same principles, they were nevertheless considerably different. The wine press was large and heavy and capable of exerting a great amount of pressure necessary to squeeze grapes. Gutenberg's printing press was smaller and more delicate and needed only apply a small amount of pressure necessary for the work of printing. Another factor which occurred at approximately the same time as Gutenberg, but independent of him, was also vital to his success: the beginning of paper in Europe. Up to Gutenberg's time, surfaces that were written on were made from cloth, from animal skins, which were expensive and available only in small quantity. The availability of paper meant that a new surface was available for Gutenberg's press, which was much cheaper and available in much greater quantity than anything before. In this way were brought together the components necessary for Gutenberg's success: his letters of metal type, a new form of ink, his adapted wine press, and the availability of paper. Gutenberg was ready to start operation. The product of his press, his magnificent Bible of 1455, was a quality of printing hardly surpassed to this day. A few copies still survive, usually the prized possession of state libraries. The benefits brought by printing were great. In the same amount of time that a scribe or copyist would take to produce a single book, a few hundred could come from the printing press. This meant that text would be available to society at large for the first time in quantity, and at a much lower price. The scribe, working slowly and laboriously, quill dipped in ink, was slowly replaced by the printing press. Little wonder that some scribes called the press the work of the devil. While printing remained within the borders of Germany, no Hebrew books appeared. This was because the German printers would not allow Jews to enter their profession. And it was only after the invention moved beyond the borders of Germany that we find the first Hebrew books appearing. The invention was likely taken to these places by Germans who chose to earn their livelihood by practicing the new art elsewhere. The first places of Hebrew printing were Italy, commencing at approximately the same time as Spain and Portugal. The first one we know of appeared around the year 1469, only 14 years after the beginning of printing. The appearance of Hebrew Sorim so soon after printing's invention was for good reason. Amongst Jews, literacy was common. What Jewish boy had not been taught the letters of the Aleph Beis in order to read the holy texts? Manuscripts, although expensive, were a prized possession in Jewish homes. Jews, therefore, were no strangers to the written word, and were quick to see the potential of the printing press in providing them with their needs. Amongst Gentiles, literacy was almost a completely new phenomenon. As a result, in the early years of printing, the proportion of Hebrew presses to those of Gentiles far exceeded the ratio of Jews to society. The first Hebrew Sefer to appear with all basic elements of identification, the place of printing, the name of the printer, and the date of printing, was Rashi's commentary on the Chumash, which was printed in Reggio di Calabria, southern Italy, in 1475. It was a modest production by today's standards and contains only the text of Rashi without Chumash, just 116 pages long. Also in 1475 appeared the Arbotorim, the Torah, of Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, printed in Pieve di Sacco, southern Italy, by Meshulam Kuzi. At that time, in the period before the Shulchan Aruch, it was one of the principal halakha sforim in use, and therefore brought to press soon after printing's invention. It contained just the Torah itself, without any commentary. The Beis Yosef and the authors of the other commentaries which later accompanied the Torah, not even yet born. The most important name in early Hebrew printing was the Sonsino family. Originating from Spain and Germany, from where Jews were expelled, they migrated south, eventually settling in the town of Sonsino. In gratitude for being granted the right of residence in the town, they took its name as their family name, Sonsino. Their first occupation in the town was as moneylenders, which was one of the few occupations open to Jews at the time. However, the opening of a public loan office forced them out of business, and they were forced to look for a new form of parnasa. They turned their hands to the new art of printing. It meant starting completely from scratch, casting letters, testing ink and paper, and purchasing a press. The first sefer to come from Sonsino's press was Masechta Brachos of Talmud Bavli, which appeared at the end of 1483. Sonsino's great innovation in their Talmud was that the Gemara, Rashi, and Tosfos all appeared on the same page for the first time. The Gemara at the center, Rashi on the inner column, and Tosfos on the outer one. Previously, in the era of manuscripts, the Gemara, Rashi, and Tosfos would usually have appeared on a separate manuscript, each on its own, if they were available at all. Sonsino had successfully aligned these letters together. For the initial work of a printer, it was a remarkable achievement. In modest words, Sonsino themselves record this achievement at the end of the volume. So writes Joshua Sonsino. I will bless Hashem, who has guided me and given me strength and courage to accomplish this holy work. To begin and complete brachas with the commentary of Rashi, Tosfos, and Piskei Tosfos, Mishnayos with the Rambam and the Mordechai. I have joined these commentaries together into one work. Sonsino also went on to print other tractates of the Talmud. However, they would not manage to print the entire Talmud. That great achievement would be accomplished first in the early years of the next century by the printer of Venice, the Gentile, Daniel Bomberg. Nevertheless, Sonsino are vital to early Hebrew printing, and we will forever be grateful to them. The other region of Hebrew printing up to the year 1500 was Spain and Portugal. However, little has survived to us from the Hebrew presses established there, since they existed only for a short period after the invention of printing, about 20 years. Hebrew printing in the Iberian Peninsula was brought to an abrupt end by the expulsion from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal 4 years later, bringing to an end almost overnight the magnificent Jewish communities of the Iberian Peninsula which had existed for centuries. Even prior to the expulsion, the Inquisition was highly active. It burned Jews and their books. The exiles from Spain and Portugal, departing in haste and in desperate conditions, could carry with them only a few items, limiting greatly any Sforim that were printed there to have survived. In addition to the benefits brought by printing to society at large, as we said, the wider availability of texts and lower prices, for Jewry there were other important benefits. Multiple commentaries began to appear on the same page as main text. Pagination, the numbering of pages, was introduced, allowing for reference to different works. Sepharim also began to appear in established editions with uniform texts, bringing to an end variant readings characteristic of the work of different scribes. As the export trade developed, Sepharim also became available internationally, no longer restricted to the area of origin. Moreover, the printing press brought with it a proliferation of Torah, as more and more authors took advantage of the opportunity given to them by the printing press to make their work available for wide public use. Printing had indeed arrived and would play a vital role in the survival of Torah and Jewry in the coming turbulent years. With the beginning of the 16th century, the printing press came to maturity. It was no longer the domain of printers like Sonsino, who were pioneers, but rather the occupation of established printing houses, both large and small. Esteemed as a trade with several years' apprenticeship for any newcomer to it, the printing shop became a common feature on the European landscape, far surpassing any other location of Hebrew printing in the 16th century was Venice, on Italy's Adriatic coast. Among the printers established there, one stood out far above the others, Daniel Bomberg. Born in Antwerp around the year 1480, he left his native town and moved to Venice. Venice at the time was one of Europe's wealthiest cities and a center of international trade conducted through its busy port. Bomberg applied to the Venetian Senate for permission to establish a printing house and to print Hebrew books. He was wealthy, influential, and a Christian, which surely aided him in being granted permission likely refused to a Jew in the anti-Semitic atmosphere of Italy at the time. From about 1516, Bomberg systematically printed the basic texts of Judaism in unequaled quality. He was assisted by some of the leading scholars of his time, who procured for him his manuscripts on which he based his edition. It seems he was sincerely interested in Hebrew Sforim, not just motivated by financial gain. For his Jewish employees, Jews being the only ones able to recognize the letters and perform the main functions, he requested dispensation from wearing the distinctive yellow hat, which was an obligation for other Jewish residents of Venice. Bomberg's greatest achievement was the printing of the entire Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which he accomplished between 1520 and 1523, which was the first ever complete printed edition. Previously, other printers had only managed to print a limited number of tractates. This was due in part to the printing process, which was still in its infancy, but in particular because a papal ban on the Talmud was still in force in Italy, and printing of it had to be conducted quietly. The ban was lifted in 1520, giving Bomberg the opportunity to go ahead and print officially. Not only was Bomberg's Talmud the first complete printed edition, but in it he introduced continuous pagination from beginning to end, from which originates the pagination of today. Furthermore, although the layout of the page of the Talmud originated from Sonsino, with Rashi on the inner column and Tosfos on the outer, Sonsino's page was relatively short, and it's from Bomberg's edition which originates exactly which words appear on each page, continued exactly to this day. Bomberg returned to his native Antwerp in later years. He was active as a printer for over 30 years. The products of his press are outstanding examples of the 16th century Hebrew press, which survive to us today in immaculate condition. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the main area of expansion in Hebrew printing was in Central Europe, namely in Amsterdam and in Germany, where a number of smaller presses were established. However, it was Amsterdam which was by far the most prolific center. The output of its presses only matched by the collective output of all the presses of Germany. Amsterdam's first Hebrew press was set up by Menashe ben Israel in 1626, when he was only 22 years old. At that time, the Jewish community of Amsterdam was made up predominantly of Moranos, like Menashe himself, descended from those who had succumbed to conversion at the time of the expulsion in the hope it would be temporary. These Moranos later managed to escape, and they returned to Judaism in Amsterdam and elsewhere. The Jewish community of Amsterdam was also continually growing due to Moranos arriving on boats from the Iberian Peninsula. Menashe dedicated himself to help these refugees return to their faith and set about providing Sforim for them. In addition to Hebrew, therefore, he printed Sforim in Roman letters, in Spanish and Portuguese, which were the languages of the new arrivals. Having been cut off from Judaism for more than 100 years, they as yet knew no Hebrew. Other than founding Amsterdam's first Hebrew press, Menashe played an important part in the negotiations with Oliver Cromwell of England for the return of Jews there, visiting England himself to petition the English Parliament. Menashe passed away in 1657. Appropriately on his grave in Amsterdam appear these words: "He is not dead, for in heaven he lies in supreme glory, while on earth his pen has won him immortal remembrance." Frankfurt am Main was one of the oldest and most distinguished of the German Jewish Kehillas, the crown jewel of German Jewry. It could trace settlement back for centuries, although this period was also marked by pogroms and expulsion. Despite such episodes, however, Frankfurt Jewry always managed to rebuild itself and start anew. The Jews of Frankfurt were confined to living in a ghetto, the Judengasse, the Jewish street, which they were free to leave only by day. Despite the restrictions placed on them, Frankfurt Jewry grew and prospered. From its crowded, narrow lanes and tall, thin buildings would come some of the most important Torah figures of the period. Such was the esteem with which Frankfurt Jewry was held, that their customs, Minhag Frankfurt, were followed by other communities in Germany and further afield. Despite the distinction of Frankfurt Jewry, however, Jews there were not able to obtain a license to print on their own and had to associate with non-Jews in order to be able to print. In Frankfurt, there were several such Gentile-owned printing houses. One of the most important of these was Johann Koellner, who in 20 years, from 1708 to 1728, issued half of the Sforim printed in Frankfurt. From the beginning of the 19th century, the center of Hebrew printing moved more and more to Eastern Europe, the heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry. Certain towns there were to achieve fame for their Hebrew presses: Warsaw, Slavita, Vilna, Lvov, and others. The Industrial Revolution began to be felt in Eastern Europe in the 1800s. It involved the use of new basic raw material, iron and steel, and new energy sources, especially coal and steam power. Goods were increasingly made by factories in centralized locations, and less locally by traditional hand methods. In the area of printing, the first major innovation of the Industrial Revolution was the all-iron press. Made of iron instead of wood, it was essentially a replica of what had preceded it. It worked according to the same principles, but had distinct advantages. Wood was a natural product which would wear with use, especially as in the press's very function, it was exerted under pressure. Over time, therefore, the wooden press produced a declining quality of print, requiring more and more work on behalf of the printer to rectify. An iron press, on the other hand, remained constant, continued printing to the same high quality. It was also easier and slightly faster to use. The most famous name in Hebrew printing in Vilna was the Rom family, one of the most important printers of the 19th century. Beginning in 1789, they opened a press in Grodno, making them the first Hebrew printers in Lithuania. Using a simple hand press and in primitive conditions, which was the best Eastern Europe could offer, they began operation. Authorization of it by the Gentile authorities in the conditions of anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe was considered quite remarkable. 10 years later, Baruch Rom opened another press 100 miles to the northeast in Vilna. However, he passed away soon afterwards, and from that time on, both presses were run by his son, Menachem Man. In 1841, Menachem Man himself passed away and was succeeded by his son, Yosef Reuven, and then by Yosef Reuven's three sons, David, Chaim Yaakov, and Menachem Man Gavriel. In 1860, David himself suddenly died while on a trip to St. Petersburg. He was considerably older than his brothers and had been the head of the printing house, his brothers as yet young and inexperienced. After his passing, therefore, there was no choice but for the burden of running the printing house to fall on his wife, his widow. The printing house then became known as the Defus Ha'almana Pa'achim Rom, the press of the widow, meaning David's wife, and his two brothers, Rom. From the Rom printing house in Vilna came basic Hebrew Sforim in great quantity. However, they are chiefly known for their editions of the Talmud, which were widely acclaimed. Most famous was their third edition, printed between 1880 and 1886 by the Almana Ba'achim Rom, which was the most extensive Talmud ever to appear. It became known as the Vilna Shas and included dozens of early commentaries printed for the first time from manuscripts, which had been located in collections far and wide. Many of them were in poor condition. Rom spared no expense in hiring expert scribes to copy them, therefore saving these precious jewels from loss. Many later commentaries were also included in the new edition, which had never been printed before, all carefully checked before printing. Rome's 1880 to 86 edition of the Talmud made a vital contribution to the Torah world and superseded all other editions. Universally regarded as the best one available, it was reprinted many times. With the advent of photomechanical methods of printing in the 1920s, meaning that a photograph could be made of an existing text, it was this edition which was used by all printers. Even the new computer-set editions of today are replicas of Rome's Talmud. A press of particular importance in 19th century Germany was founded by Wolf Heidenheim in 1798. It was located at Rodelheim, near to Frankfurt am Main. In 1800, Heidenheim began to print his famous work, a set of Machzorim, in 9 volumes. He was an expert in Hebrew grammar and was able to provide a precise text. He also had a full grasp of piyutim, additions to doubling characteristic particularly of German Jewry, a commentary of which he wrote and included in the work. In addition, he provided an up-to-date German translation, well attuned to the needs of German Jewry of the time. As a result, Heidenheim's Machzor was widely used and went into numerous printings. The Hasam Sofer, who was a contemporary of Heidenheim, wrote in praise of him these words: "Were it not for Heidenheim, piyutim would have been forgotten from Jewry." Hebrew printing began in Eretz Israel in recent times in Tzfas in the north with the arrival of Yisrael Bach in 1832. The first time it had taken place in the land of Israel for a gap of over 250 years. Bach was a Ruzhina Chassid from Berdichov in the Ukraine, where he'd been active as a printer. He brought with him to Tzfas his printing equipment and 2 wooden presses. However, in January 1837, a devastating earthquake hit the Galil, destroying almost the entire Jewish settlement there. Bach survived, but his press did not. It had produced only 7 Sforim during the 5 years of its existence. Many of the survivors of the earthquake, including Bach, moved to Yerushalayim. It was the time of the old Yishuv in the land of Israel, before the large immigration of the 1880s. Jewish life there was characterized by simple living and spiritual sanctity. Outside the walls of Yerushalayim, the terrain was rough and uncultivated, and dangerous after nightfall. At that time, missionaries were active in the Holy City and planned to open a printing press to distribute material in Hebrew. In order to counter this threat, the rabbinic authorities of the time approached Bach and asked him to open a press of his own. At his print shop in Yerushalayim, Bach used an all-iron press sent to him from England by the philanthropist Moshe Montefiore, complete with a machine for casting metal type. Montefiore had met Bach on a previous visit to the Holy Land, afterwards sending him this press. Bach acknowledged Montefiore's generous gift by stating on the title pages of Sforim printed on it, "Printed on the press donated by Moshe," meaning Moses, and his wife Yehudis Montefiore. Bach was distinguished as the first Hebrew printer in Eretz Israel in recent times with his press in Tzfas, and the first ever Hebrew printer in Yerushalayim. The Hebrew book was also to suffer greatly from persecution and censorship through the generations. Arising officially from the desire of the church to eliminate anything unfavorable to them, and out of an underlying desire to suppress Judaism, persecution and censorship of the Hebrew book is an account of confiscations and burnings under the authority of the church. It resembles closely the history of the Jewish people over the same period. The Hebrew book was also to suffer greatly at the hands of apostates, Jews themselves who had left their religion and turned on their former co-religionists. They distorted the meaning of the text and slandered the Holy Sforim, causing untold harm. From the early days of printing, however, there were also Gentiles who came to the defense of the Hebrew book. These advocates were usually academics or clergymen who, due to their education, valued the Holy Sfarim with their commentaries. Amongst them were authors of Hebrew Sfarim themselves, usually grammars, intended to teach Gentiles the Holy Tongue. With the beginning of printing, new questions arose in halakha for the first time, nogea to the printing press. The first and basic question: could we actually use the printing press to print Torah? Where does the question apply? It applies to those mitzvahs which have a din of kasiva, where the Torah says, "You shall write." Which are these? A Sefer Torah, the scrolls inside tefillin, a mezuzah, a get, a document of divorce. Each of these has a din of kasiva according to the Torah. They are required to be written. In addition, Chazal required that a Megillas Esther, meaning the one we use on Purim for public reading with brachas, needs to be written, the Mishnah Megillah 2:2. The question therefore arose: we know that each of these are required to be written, but could they be printed as well? Or asked differently, is printing the same as writing, therefore satisfying the requirements of writing? The poskim saw that the letters produced by the printing press were in their correct form, each one separate, and certainly as good as the written one. However, the maskana amongst the poskim is clearly to forbid printing those areas which have a din of kasiva, for these reasons. Writing means that each letter is produced individually with its kavana, intention to write that letter, and its shape, one letter at a time. In short, printing is not the same process as writing. Secondly, a sofer writing a Sefer Torah, or a scroll for tefillin, or a mezuzah, has to see or say each word before he writes it. This cannot be achieved with the printing press, where all the words are printed in one go as the press comes down. Tefillin and mezuzahs also have to be written kasidram, in the order of letters and words as they appear, one letter at a time. This again cannot be achieved in printing, where all the letters are produced in one go. For these reasons, it was clearly also to use the printing press for those mitzvahs with the din of kasiva. However, all other sfarim, sidurim, maksorim, chumashim, gemaras, everything else that we use, could indeed be printed without question, with the many benefits that printing would bring. Today, Sfarim are produced by computers and laser printers. The printing press has come to an end and lies silent. Yet it gave us the Sfarim of the generations until our own time, a period of more than 500 years, in fulfillment of the promise of Hashem that Torah would not be forgotten from Israel. Thank you.